That's my daughter. What did you do to her?" The woman shouted across the mall floor. Security was already moving, hands on radios, eyes locked on the maintenance worker kneeling beside the small girl. The child clutched his sleeve and cried while shoppers slowed to stare. Someone whispered that it looked suspicious, that security should separate them immediately. But the quiet single dad didn't argue or raise his voice. He simply stayed where he was, one steady hand resting on the frightened girl's shoulder. Minutes later, the entire mall would realize they had judged the wrong man. Because sometimes the people everyone overlooks are the only ones ready when things fall apart. Before I show you the exact moment when the maintenance worker saved that child in front of the guards accusing him. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. What nobody around them understood was that the quiet worker kneeling on cold tile had spent years running toward emergencies others ran from. They saw a uniform and a toolbox. They didn't see the training buried behind a life that had been rebuilt after loss. The little girl kept crying, small fingers twisted in the fabric of his sleeve. "Hey kid, it's okay," he murmured softly, lowering himself closer so she didn't have to look up at the crowd. Escalator motors hummed above them, and the smell of cinnamon pretzels drifted through the bright atrium. None of it seemed to reach the trembling child. He had already scanned the surroundings the way old instincts demanded. No parent in sight, no frantic voice calling her name, just shoppers watching and security boots approaching fast. "Sir, step away from the child." The security supervisor's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. He looked up calmly, but didn't move his hand from the girl's shoulder. "She's lost," he said quietly. "Found her near the fountain." The supervisor frowned, clearly unconvinced. Two more guards formed a loose circle as curious shoppers slowed their steps. The child tightened her grip again. "Don't let them take me," she whispered, voice shaking. The words hit him harder than the suspicion in the guard's eyes. He leaned closer. "Hey, nobody's taking you anywhere, all right?" Calm, steady, the same tone he once used in far louder places. Footsteps clicked sharply across marble as the girl's mother pushed through the crowd. "Leela." The woman rushed forward, expensive heels echoing, panic blazing across her face. Security straightened instantly. One guard gestured toward the kneeling maintenance worker. "That's my daughter. What happened?" Her eyes moved from the child to the man beside her and hardened. Suspicion arrived before gratitude. She was alone, he said, just trying to keep her calm. The mother pulled the girl toward her, protective arms wrapping tight. But the child suddenly swayed. Her small body went strangely limp. Ethan felt the change instantly. Years of training stirred before thought. The girl's breathing sounded wrong. Too shallow. Too fast. "Ma'am, something's not right." The mother froze, confusion cutting through her anger. "What do you mean?" she demanded. He was already reaching for the child's wrist, pulse racing, too irregular. Around them radios crackled and the crowd pressed closer. The supervisor spoke into his mic. "Get medical down here." But the maintenance worker's attention never left the child. He lowered her gently to the floor before anyone could object. The mother stared in stunned silence. Authority meant nothing against the quiet certainty in his movements. Shoppers held their breath. Somewhere an alarm chimed from a distant storefront. The mall suddenly felt too bright, too loud, too small. He tilted the girl's head carefully, listening. "Stay with us, kid, just breathe." The mother knelt beside them, fear replacing suspicion. Is she going to be okay?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he focused on the rhythm of the child's breathing. Old memories flickered at the edges of his mind. Desert heat, helicopter blades, voices shouting for a medic. He pushed the memories away. She needs space. Security hesitated. Then the supervisor motioned the crowd back. Air moved again around the child. The maintenance worker exhaled slowly. Somewhere deep inside, he already knew this night wasn't over. The girl's breathing hitched again beneath his steady hand. He glanced up at the mother. Does she have any medical conditions? The woman blinked, stunned. Asthma, sometimes. That was enough to confirm his fear. He reached for the small tool pouch hanging from his belt. The supervisor watched carefully now. Suspicion slowly giving way to uncertainty because the man they had been questioning moved with absolute confidence. And somewhere between the humming escalators and the stunned silence of the crowd, the truth about the quiet maintenance worker was about to surface in the next few seconds, everyone watching. The little girl's chest rose and fell too quickly. "Leela, sweetheart, look at me," her mother said, voice trembling as she held the child's hand. But the girl barely reacted. The maintenance worker leaned closer, listening carefully to each breath. It had a faint wheeze buried under the panic, the kind most people would miss in a noisy mall. He didn't miss it. "Does she have an inhaler?" he asked without looking up. The woman blinked, startled by the question. Yes, in my bag." Her hands fumbled through an expensive leather purse before she pulled out the small inhaler with shaking fingers. He took it gently. "All right, Leela, we're going to help you breathe, okay?" Security Supervisor Darius Holt watched closely now, arms crossed. Only minutes earlier he had been ready to escort the man away from the child. Now he wasn't sure what he was seeing. The worker positioned the inhaler carefully and guided the girl through the motion. "Slow breath, that's it," the girl tried. Her chest shuddered, a thin gasp slipped out, her mother's panic surged again. "Why isn't it working?" He stayed calm. Sometimes panic makes it worse. He glanced up briefly. "Ambulance coming?" One of the guards spoke into his radio. "Paramedics are on the way." Around them, the crowd had thickened. Phones hovered in the air, whispers moved like wind. The worker ignored all of it. His attention stayed fixed on the child. He gently lifted her chin again, adjusting her position so her airway stayed clear. The woman watched every movement now with a new kind of fear. "What are you doing?" Helping her breathe. His voice stayed steady. The supervisor stepped closer, kneeling beside them now. "You trained for this, or something?" The worker gave a short nod without looking away from the girl. Something like that. Another shallow breath rattled from the child. He checked her pulse again, still racing, too fast, but still strong. That mattered. He looked at the mother again. When was her last asthma attack? A few months ago, but never like this. Her voice cracked. The man nodded slowly. "Okay, stay calm." "She needs you calm." The words sounded simple, but they carried quiet authority. Even the security supervisor noticed. The expensive marble floor felt colder by the second as the mother knelt beside them. She held her daughter's hand tighter. "I'm here, baby." The child's eyes fluttered weakly. The worker spoke again, low and steady. "Good, keep talking to her." Footsteps thundered somewhere near the entrance as the mall's medical response team hurried closer. The radio on Holt's shoulder crackled. "Paramedics 2 minutes out." 2 minutes. The man measured the time automatically. 2 minutes could feel like forever when someone couldn't breathe. He shifted slightly, keeping the child upright. Airflow mattered. Small adjustments mattered. Everything mattered. "Leela, take another slow breath for me." The girl tried again. A thin inhale finally filled her lungs a little deeper. Not perfect, but better. The maintenance worker nodded to himself. Good sign. Security Supervisor Holt watched carefully now, confusion slowly replacing suspicion. This wasn't panic, this was control. And that realization unsettled him. A moment earlier he had been questioning the man like a suspect. Now the situation looked very different. The mother noticed it too. She studied the worker's calm hands, the way he monitored the child without hesitation. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. He hesitated. Just a second. Then he gave a simple answer. "Just someone who found your daughter." The girl coughed suddenly. Sharp. Painful. The sound echoed across the atrium. The mother gasped. The worker reacted instantly, guiding the child forward so the cough cleared her airway instead of choking her. "Good, let it out." Another cough followed, then another, each one louder, each one pushing air deeper into her lungs. The crowd collectively exhaled. The girl finally managed a shaky breath. Not perfect, but stronger. The maintenance worker relaxed his shoulders slightly. Paramedics burst through the mall entrance seconds later with a stretcher. Moved back, they quickly knelt beside the child. One medic examined her breathing while the other checked vital signs. Then both looked at the worker. "You stabilized her?" He shrugged lightly. "Just kept her breathing." The medic gave a small, impressed nod. "Good work." The words hung in the air. Security Supervisor Holt noticed the change instantly. The paramedic spoke to the maintenance worker like a colleague. Not a suspect, not a stranger, a professional. The mother noticed it too. Her eyes widened slightly. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked the medic. The medic checked the monitor again. "She's improving." Relief rushed through the crowd like a quiet wave. The child blinked weakly now, breathing steadier. The worker slowly leaned back, giving the medic space. His job here was done. Or at least that's what he thought. But the security supervisor's voice stopped him before he could stand. "Hold on a second." Holt studied him carefully now. The suspicion hadn't vanished, but something else had replaced it. Curiosity. "Where'd you learn to handle a situation like that?" The man wiped his hands quietly on a cloth from his belt pouch. For a moment, he looked like exactly what everyone had assumed. Just a maintenance worker finishing a messy task. Then he answered calmly. "Old job." The supervisor narrowed his eyes. "What kind of job teaches you that?" The worker stood slowly now. The bright mall lights reflected off the polished floors as the crowd continued watching. He met Holt's gaze for only a second. "Combat medicine." The words landed softly. But the silence they created was thunder. "Combat medicine." The words settled into the air like a sudden drop in temperature. Security Supervisor Darius Holt stared at him, unsure if he had heard correctly. The paramedic kneeling beside the child glanced up as well, interest flickering across his face. "You serious?" Holt asked. The maintenance worker didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched the paramedics attach a monitor to the girl's finger, tracking her oxygen levels. The steady beep of the device cut through the murmuring crowd. Her breathing had slowed, not normal yet, but no longer desperate. That mattered. "Used to be," he finally replied. The paramedic checking her airway looked up again. "Army?" He nodded once. "Yeah." That was all he offered. The mother, Marina Velez, remained kneeling beside her daughter, her hands trembling as she brushed the girl's hair from her forehead. The expensive calm she carried earlier had completely vanished. Now she looked like any terrified parent. "You said combat medicine?" she asked quietly. He shrugged again. "Long time ago," but the paramedic studying the monitor wasn't convinced. "You didn't just learn a little somewhere," he said. "You cleared her airway, stabilized her breathing, and kept her conscious through an asthma crash." He paused. "That's trained work." The worker glanced at him briefly. Kid needed help. That was the only explanation he seemed willing to give. The medic gave a faint smile. Still, good instincts. Another paramedic arrived, pushing the stretcher through the thinning crowd. Vitals? Improving, the first medic replied. They carefully helped the girl onto the stretcher. Her small fingers instinctively reached for the worker again. Don't go. The words came out hoarse but clear. He stepped closer so she could still see him. I'm right here, kid. Her mother watched that exchange with quiet confusion. Moments earlier, she had been ready to accuse him of something terrible. Now her daughter was holding his sleeve like it was the only safe thing left in the room. The medic secured the straps. Ma'am, we're taking her to St. Gabriel's to monitor her breathing, one of them told Marina. She nodded quickly. Yes, of course. Then she looked back at the man beside her daughter. I'm sorry about earlier, she said, voice tight with emotion. You were just protecting your kid, he replied simply. But security supervisor Holt still hadn't moved. He studied the maintenance worker the way people look at puzzles. Something about the situation refused to fit the assumptions he had started with. You work maintenance here? Holt asked. Night shift. The supervisor's brow furrowed, and before that, the worker picked up his small tool pouch from the floor. Different life. The paramedic chuckled lightly. That's one way to put it. The stretcher wheels locked into place, and the medics began rolling the child toward the mall entrance. The girl's eyes searched the crowd again. She spotted him instantly. Are you coming? He hesitated. Just a second. Before he could answer, the mother stepped forward. If he could ride along, that would help keep her calm. Holt blinked. The woman who had arrived furious minutes earlier was now asking the maintenance worker to stay beside her daughter. The medics shrugged. Fine by us, but the worker shook his head gently. She'll be okay. The girl frowned weakly. You promise? He nodded. Promise. Her small fingers finally loosened their grip on his sleeve. The stretcher rolled away. Marina hurried beside it, still clutching her daughter's hand. For a moment, the mall entrance filled with flashing red lights from the ambulance outside. Then, the doors closed, and the crowd slowly began to disperse. The atrium returned to its usual rhythm, escalators humming, music drifting from nearby stores, conversations rising again. But Holt remained standing in front of the maintenance worker. Combat medic, the supervisor said again. The man simply slung the tool pouch over his shoulder. Used to be, why leave something like that to fix escalators? The question hung there. The worker considered it. Then he gave the simplest answer possible. Life changes. He started walking toward the service corridor. But Holt followed a few steps behind. Hold on. The worker stopped but didn't turn around. What? Holt crossed his arms. You handled that situation better than most emergency responders I've seen, he hesitated. So forgive me if I'm curious why a former military medic is mopping floors in a shopping mall. The maintenance worker slowly turned back. For the first time since the chaos began, something flickered in his expression. Not anger, not embarrassment, just quiet exhaustion. My son needed me home, he said. The explanation landed heavier than the earlier revelation. Holt didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded. The worker turned again and stepped into the dim hallway leading to the maintenance area. The bright mall lights faded behind him as the doors swung closed. Back in the atrium, the last of the crowd drifted away. But one person remained standing there longer than the others. Security Supervisor Darius Holt. He stared at the empty floor where the child had collapsed minutes earlier. And for the first time that evening, he realized how close things had come to going very wrong. The service corridor door clicked shut behind him, muting the noise of the mall almost instantly. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The air smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and warm machinery. It was the kind of quiet place most shoppers never noticed. The place where people like him actually worked. He walked a few steps down the hallway, letting the tension drain slowly from his shoulders. The adrenaline from the emergency still lingered in his muscles. Old instincts never really disappeared. They just waited. He reached the small utility sink near the maintenance closet and turned on the cold water. The faucet rattled for a second before a steady stream flowed out. He washed his hands carefully. The sound of running water filled the narrow space. For a moment, everything felt calm again. But the memory of the girl's breathing still echoed in his mind. Too fast. Too shallow. He had seen that look too many times before. Different places. Different crises. Same fragile line between panic and survival. He shut the faucet off and grabbed a paper towel. Behind him, footsteps suddenly echoed down the corridor. Fast ones. He turned slightly just as the door to the atrium swung open again. Security Supervisor Holt stepped inside. "You got a minute?" The worker sighed quietly. "Thought we finished that conversation." Holt leaned against the wall, arms folded. "Maybe." He studied the man again, the same puzzled look returning. "You didn't even hesitate back there. That kid needed help. That's not what I mean." Holt shook his head slightly. Most people freeze when something like that happens. The worker tossed the used towel into a bin. "I didn't." "No," Holt agreed slowly. "You definitely didn't." The silence stretched between them. Through the wall, faint mall music drifted into the hallway. "Why didn't you mention the medic training earlier?" Holt asked. The man shrugged. "No one asked. You could have avoided a lot of suspicion, wouldn't have changed anything." Holt considered that. Maybe he was right. People had already decided who the maintenance worker was before hearing a single explanation. A radio crackled on Holt's shoulder. "Unit 3, update from paramedics." Holt pressed the button. "Go ahead. Child is stable. Oxygen levels normalizing." Relief slipped quietly into the corridor. Even the worker's shoulders eased slightly. "Good," Holt said into the radio. The channel clicked silent again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Holt asked another question. "You've been working here long?" "About a year, and before that?" The man leaned against the sink, clearly debating how much he wanted to explain. Different hospitals, field units, bases. Holt blinked. "You were active military that whole time?" "10 years. The supervisor let out a low whistle. 10 years saving lives, and now you're unclogging drains." The worker gave a faint half-smile. "Life's weird like that, still doesn't explain the switch." He rubbed the back of his neck slowly. "My wife died 3 years ago." The words came quietly. No drama, no bitterness, just fact. Holt immediately regretted pushing the conversation. "I'm sorry." "Yeah." The man stared at the floor for a moment. She had a medical emergency at home. The silence thickened again. "I wasn't there," he added. Holt didn't know what to say. The worker looked up again. "So after that, priorities changed." He nodded toward the atrium beyond the wall. "My kid needed a father more than the army needed another medic." Holt understood that, even if he had never lived it. Another burst of radio chatter broke the quiet. "Supervisor Holt, ambulance just left the hospital." Holt frowned. "What do you mean?" "Mother requested a quick return to the mall." The supervisor blinked. That was fast. Apparently the child asked for someone. Holt glanced slowly toward the maintenance worker. "You?" The man frowned slightly. "Why?" Holt shrugged. "Kid's request." Footsteps suddenly echoed again from the corridor entrance. This time hurried ones. The door swung open. A mall employee leaned inside, slightly out of breath. "They're back already. Who?" Holt asked. "The woman and her daughter." The worker straightened. "They released her that quickly?" Doctor cleared her for observation at home. The employee gestured toward the atrium. She's asking for the guy who helped her. Holt chuckled quietly. Well, looks like your shift isn't done yet. The maintenance worker sighed. Figures. They walked back toward the atrium together. The mall lights grew brighter as the door opened again, and the moment they stepped inside, the girl spotted him instantly. Hey! Her voice was still weak, but cheerful. She sat in a wheelchair now, wrapped in a hospital blanket. Her mother stood behind her, exhaustion written across her face, but relief was there too. When the girl saw him approaching, she smiled. A real one this time. You came back, she said. He crouched slightly so they were eye level again. Looks like you did too. The child giggled softly. Her mother stepped forward. Mister. He paused. Then finally answered. Ethan, Marina Velez nodded. Mr. Cole, the doctors said if you hadn't acted when you did, her airway could have closed completely. Her voice trembled again. I owe you my daughter's life. The maintenance worker shook his head gently. You don't owe me anything. But Security Supervisor Holt watched the moment carefully because the entire atmosphere of the mall had changed. Earlier that evening, people had looked at Ethan like a suspect. Now the same crowd watching nearby looked at him like something entirely different. And none of them realized yet that the night's biggest revelation was still coming. And you're the one who saved me. The girl's voice was soft but certain as she looked up from the wheelchair. Ethan gave a small shrug. You did most of the work. I just reminded you how to breathe. Leela giggled, the sound thin but much stronger than before. Marina Velez stood beside her daughter, one hand resting protectively on the wheelchair handle. The panic that had ruled her earlier was fading, replaced by a quiet exhaustion and a gratitude she still seemed unsure how to express. The bright lights of the mall atrium reflected off the polished floor again, but the atmosphere had shifted. A few people still lingered nearby, whispering and glancing toward the small group. Security Supervisor Darius Holt noticed it too. Earlier those looks had carried suspicion. Now they carried curiosity, and something close to admiration. Marina cleared her throat. Mr. Cole. The doctor explained everything on the ride back. Ethan leaned slightly against the railing near the escalator, hands resting casually on his tool pouch. Good news, I hope. She'll be fine, Marina said. The inhaler just didn't kick in fast enough during the panic. She paused before continuing. But the doctor also said something else. Ethan tilted his head slightly. He said whoever stabilized her knew exactly what they were doing. Holt crossed his arms quietly, waiting. Marina continued. He asked if you worked in emergency medicine. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. Used to. The girl looked between them curiously. You were a doctor? He chuckled. No, kid. Just the guy doctors yell for when things get messy. Leela grinned at that. Marina studied him again. You said combat medicine earlier. Yeah. You don't just walk away from something like that. Ethan shrugged lightly. Sometimes life makes a decision for you. Before she could respond, Holt stepped forward. He mentioned his wife earlier, the supervisor said gently. Marina's expression softened immediately. Oh. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Look, your daughter's breathing fine now. That's what matters. Leela suddenly pointed at the tool pouch hanging from his belt. Is that where your medical stuff is? He glanced down at it. Nope, just wrenches and screwdrivers, but you helped me with it. Improvisation. She considered that word seriously. Then nodded like it made perfect sense. Marina watched the exchange carefully. You stayed calm through all of that, she said. I've seen worse. The statement wasn't meant to impress anyone. It simply slipped out like a quiet fact. But Holt noticed something in the man's tone. Memories. The kind people carried long after the war ended. The security supervisor shifted slightly. You didn't even raise your voice when we questioned you earlier. Ethan looked at him calmly. Didn't seem helpful. Holt chuckled. Fair point. Marina exhaled slowly. I owe you more than just a thank you. Ethan shook his head again. No, you don't. You saved my daughter's life. He glanced at Lila, who was now studying the mall ceiling lights like they were the most interesting thing she had ever seen. I helped, he corrected gently. The little girl suddenly turned back toward him. Are you coming with us next time? He blinked. Next time what? When we go to the mall again? Marina laughed softly despite the emotional exhaustion. Lila. But Ethan smiled. I'll probably be here. That's where I work. The girl nodded approvingly. Good. Nearby, a few shoppers continued whispering. Phones had captured parts of the earlier scene. Security Supervisor Holt noticed the attention spreading. Looks like you've got an audience now, he muttered. Ethan glanced around and sighed quietly. Fantastic. Marina noticed the same thing. People are talking about what happened. That's how crowds work. But they're talking about you. He shrugged again. Give it a day. They'll forget. Holt wasn't so sure. A maintenance worker performing emergency medical intervention in the middle of a crowded mall wasn't something people forgot easily. Lila yawned suddenly, her small body sagging in the wheelchair. Marina immediately leaned down. You're tired. The girl nodded slowly. Ethan crouched again so she didn't have to tilt her head. You did great today, did I? Absolutely. She smiled again, eyes growing heavy. Thanks for helping me breathe. Something in Ethan's chest tightened for a moment. He had heard similar words before. In very different places. Any time, kid. Marina gently turned the wheelchair toward the exit. We should get her home before she moved away. She paused again in front of him. Mr. Cole, I hope we see you again. You probably will. And next time, she added quietly, I'll recognize the hero sooner. Ethan shook his head with a faint smile. I'm just the maintenance guy. But as Marina pushed the wheelchair toward the glass doors and the cool night outside, Security Supervisor Holt watched Ethan carefully. Because he had spent years reading people in tense situations, and the man standing beside the escalator was definitely not just a maintenance guy. By the way, if stories like this remind you that real heroes often go unnoticed, make sure you subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next one. Holt folded his arms and glanced at the quiet worker beside him. You ever notice something, Cole? What's that? The people who say they're just doing their job. He nodded toward the exit where the child had just been taken home. Usually did something far bigger. Ethan didn't answer Holt right away. He simply watched the glass doors slide shut behind Marina and Lila as they disappeared into the cool evening outside. The flashing ambulance lights were gone now, replaced by the steady glow of the mall's parking lot lamps. The crisis had passed. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. He adjusted the strap of his tool pouch and turned toward the service corridor again. Shift's not over, he said calmly. Holt followed beside him. You just saved a kid in front of half the mall. Pretty sure your shift gets a pass tonight. Ethan pushed open the maintenance door. Escalator 3 still makes that grinding noise every time it starts. That escalator can wait. Machines don't care about dramatic moments. The supervisor laughed quietly. You're a strange guy, Cole. Inside the corridor, the quiet returned again. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Ethan pulled a small flashlight from his pouch. He crouched beside an access panel near the escalator base. Metal screws loosened with a quick twist of his wrench. Routine. Predictable. Safe. Holt leaned against the wall, watching him work. You miss it? Ethan glanced up briefly. Miss what? The army. The wrench clicked softly against metal. Sometimes, yeah? Mostly the people. Holt nodded. That part I get. The escalator motor hummed above them as Ethan inspected the mechanism. A small alignment issue, nothing dramatic. He adjusted the gear housing carefully. But just as he tightened the final bolt, Holt's radio crackled again. Supervisor Holt. He pressed the button. Go ahead. Call from the hospital. Holt frowned. I thought the girl was already released. She was. The voice on the radio sounded slightly confused. But the doctor asked if the man who stabilized her earlier is still there. Holt looked down at Ethan. Yeah, he's here. Doctor said to tell him something important. Ethan slowly set his wrench down. What kind of important? Holt pressed the radio closer. Go ahead. The reply came through clearly. The child didn't just have an asthma attack. Ethan's posture shifted instantly. Years of training sharpened his attention again. What do you mean? Holt asked. The ER doctor reviewed the airway reaction. There were signs of something else triggering the episode. Ethan stood slowly now. An allergic reaction? He asked. The radio voice paused. That's exactly what they're trying to confirm. A cold thread of concern slid through Ethan's chest. Did she eat anything before the attack? He asked Holt quietly. Holt frowned. I don't know. The radio crackled again. Doctor says if the man who helped her noticed anything unusual before she collapsed, it could help identify the trigger. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, replaying the moment in his mind. The fountain area, the girl crying, the wheezing. Then something else surfaced in his memory. A smell. Sweet. Strong. Pretzels, he muttered. Holt blinked. What? There was a pretzel stand near where I found her. The radio picked it up. Repeat that? Cinnamon pretzels, Ethan said. Heavy sugar coating. Another pause. Then the voice came back sharper. That could be it, Holt straightened. What are you saying? The voice on the radio answered carefully. Severe cinnamon allergies can cause airway reactions that look exactly like asthma attacks. Ethan felt the realization settle heavily. If she inhaled cinnamon powder in the air, the radio voice finished the thought. It could trigger the entire event. Holt rubbed his forehead. You're telling me the smell from a food stand nearly killed that kid? In rare cases, yes. Ethan turned slowly toward the atrium entrance. Shoppers still moved casually past the pretzel kiosk near the fountain. Steam drifted up from trays of freshly baked dough. The smell of cinnamon hung thick in the air. He studied it carefully now, and something about it didn't sit right. Hold on, he said quietly. Holt noticed the change immediately. What? Ethan stepped toward the atrium. That smell is stronger than it should be. Holt followed him. What does that mean? Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. In enclosed spaces like this, he inhaled carefully again. That much airborne cinnamon powder spreads fast. They reached the railing overlooking the main floor. Shoppers walked directly past the pretzel stand. Kids laughed. Parents chatted. No one seemed to notice anything unusual. But Ethan's instincts had already locked on to the problem. What are you thinking? Holt asked. Ethan watched a worker behind the stand shake another tray of cinnamon sugar across fresh pretzels. A thick cloud of powder lifted into the air. Floating. Drifting. Exactly the kind of airborne exposure that could trigger the reaction Leela had experienced, and if she had collapsed from a brief exposure, Ethan's stomach tightened. How many other kids with allergies walk through here every hour? He said quietly. Holt froze. The question landed like a warning siren, because suddenly the incident with the little girl didn't look like a random accident anymore. It looked like a problem waiting to happen again. Holt leaned forward over the railing, eyes narrowing at the pretzel kiosk below. The employee behind the counter shook another tray of cinnamon sugar over fresh dough, sending a soft cloud drifting through the air. Most shoppers didn't even notice. But now that Ethan had pointed it out, Holt couldn't unsee it. That much powder just floating around, Holt muttered. Ethan nodded once. Air currents move it everywhere. They both watched a young child run past the stand laughing, cutting straight through the drifting cinnamon haze. Nothing happened. But that didn't mean it couldn't. Holt rubbed his jaw slowly. You think that's what triggered the girl's attack? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He studied the space carefully instead. The mall's ventilation fans pushed air gently across the atrium, circulating smells from nearby restaurants. Cinnamon, coffee, fried food, normally pleasant scents. But for someone with a severe allergy, that same circulation could become dangerous. I can't prove it, Ethan said finally. But the timing lines up. Holt tapped his radio. Mall control, come in. Static answered. Then a voice. Control here. Do we have any allergy complaints tied to the pretzel stand recently? A pause followed. Not that I know of. Ethan kept watching the drifting powder. The kiosk worker shook another tray. More cinnamon dust lifted. He exhaled slowly. That stand's using way too much. Holt glanced sideways. You can tell that just by looking? Smell it, Holt did. The scent was strong enough to sting his nose. Yeah, all right. That's pretty intense. Below them, a woman walking past suddenly sneezed. Then another. Nothing serious. But enough to make Holt uneasy. If a kid with a bad allergy walked through that cloud, Ethan finished the thought quietly. They could collapse the same way. Holt straightened. Great. The supervisor pressed his radio again. Control, I want maintenance ventilation readings near the fountain area. The response came quickly. Checking. Ethan stepped toward the escalator and started walking down. Holt followed. You planning something? Just looking. They reached the main floor and moved toward the kiosk. The scent of cinnamon grew stronger with each step. Ethan's nose wrinkled slightly. Definitely excessive. The employee behind the counter smiled politely when they approached. Can I help you guys? Holt flashed his security badge. Quick question. The employee nodded. Sure. Ethan looked at the tray of cinnamon mixture. How often do you apply that coating? Every batch. How much? The worker shrugged. Manager says keep it generous. Holt gestured toward the drifting powder. Ever had anyone complain about allergies? The employee hesitated. A few parents mentioned it being strong. Ethan exchanged a glance with Holt. How many? Maybe 3 or 4 this week. That answer made Holt's jaw tighten. Did management log those complaints? The worker shook his head slowly. I don't think so. Holt pressed his radio again. Control, get the mall operations manager down here now. Copy. Ethan looked up at the air vents above the kiosk. A thin stream of cinnamon particles floated toward the center. Men like you were made for carrying things, Desmond Varro said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. Plates, bags, other people's problems. That's the ceiling, and honestly, it suits you. The table laughed, every single one of them, and the man holding the water pitcher said nothing. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below, because what happened next in that dining room didn't just silence a billionaire. It dismantled him. In front of his board, his investors, and 2 journalists who had come to write about his charity work. This isn't a story about a server getting even. It's about what happens when power spends so long looking down, it forgets to look across. Marcus Hale had been awake since 5:30 that morning. Not because of the shift, he'd worked stranger hours than a Saturday evening gala. He was awake because Lily had had one of her bad nights, the kind where the medication kept her restless, and he'd sit at the edge of her bed doing nothing useful, just being there. Which was the only thing that seemed to help. By 6, he'd given up on sleep entirely, made her the oatmeal she liked with the sliced banana arranged in a smiley face, and watched her eat it with the particular concentration of a child who had learned not to rush good things. She was 9 years old and already more patient than most adults he'd ever worked with. He'd ironed his work shirt at the kitchen counter while she finished breakfast, which was not where shirts were supposed to be ironed, but the board had been stored behind a box in the closet for 8 months, and he'd never quite gotten around to retrieving it. The shirt came out fine. It always did. Marcus had a way of making imperfect conditions produce acceptable results, something that had served him well in rooms far more demanding than this kitchen, in roles he no longer carried a title for. The framed photograph on the windowsill caught the morning light the way it always did around 6:45. A government building atrium, marble floors, a younger version of him in a dark suit receiving something from a man in a better suit. He'd stopped noticing it years ago the way you stop noticing a scar. It's there. It's part of the landscape. It doesn't require daily acknowledgement. Lily's appointment was at 9. Dr. Fennick ran a tight schedule, and Marcus respected that. They took the bus because parking near the hospital district was a particular form of financial punishment he saw no reason to volunteer for, and Lily liked the bus anyway. She liked watching the city move past the window and naming things. Bakery. Dog. That building's very tall. Man with a blue umbrella. She catalogued the world with quiet enthusiasm, and Marcus catalogued her cataloging it, which was its own kind of piece. The waiting room at the specialist's office had a row of chairs along a wall and a cluster of small tables with magazines no one read. Marcus sat beside Lily with a paperback he'd borrowed from the building's lobby exchange shelf, someone's discarded thriller, decent enough, and read to her in a low voice while she leaned against his arm. 3 chairs down, a man in a tailored blazer typed rapidly on a laptop. His daughter beside him building something out of the waiting room's small basket of Lego with the focused self-sufficiency of a child accustomed to occupying herself. Marcus noticed the girl. He usually noticed the children first. Dr. Fennick said what she'd said for the past 4 months. Stable, monitoring, adjusting the evening dosage by a small margin to address the restless nights. Marcus asked 2 questions, wrote the answers in the small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, and thanked her the way he thanked everyone who did their job well and deserved to know it. They were back on the bus by 10:40. Lily pressed her palm against the window as they passed a fountain in the civic square, water catching the late morning sun. "It looks like it's full of diamonds," she said. "It does," Marcus agreed. She thought about that for a moment. Do you think the people who built it knew it would do that? He considered the question seriously, the way she deserved. "I think some of them did," he said, "and I think some of them were just trying to build something good, and the diamonds were a bonus." She seemed satisfied with that. She leaned back against him and watched the fountain until it disappeared behind a building. His shift started at 5. He'd have her settled with the neighbor who watched her on his evening shifts, uniform pressed, on the bus downtown, by 4:15. He didn't know yet what the evening would cost him, or what it would return. The Velthorpe Grand Hotel did not advertise itself. It didn't need to. It sat at the corner of Meridian and 5th like a statement, 12 stories of pale limestone and brass fittings, the kind of building that had decided long ago it was above signage. The city knew where it was. The people who mattered knew how to get in. Everyone else was scenery. Marcus came in through the service entrance on Callaway Lane, the way he always did, the way all of them did, a narrow door beside a loading dock that smelled of industrial detergent and last night's kitchen exhaust. He badged in, collected his apron and order pad from the staff room, and listened to the floor manager, a compact woman named Deb, run through the evening's parameters with the efficiency of someone who had done this 400 times and intended to do it 400 more. The Varotech Annual Charity Gala. 340 guests. 7-course tasting menu. 2 vegetarian tables, 1 kosher station, 1 table, with a nut allergy so severe that Deb said the word severe twice, and made eye contact with everyone individually when she said it. Open bar from 7. Speeches at 9. The client expected invisible service, present when needed, absent when not, and never, under any circumstances, the subject of anyone's attention. Marcus wrote nothing down. He didn't need to. Around him, the other servers were adjusting collar buttons and comparing section assignments. He'd been given the center floor, the prestige tables, where the most important guests sat and where the margin for error was thinnest. Deb gave him that assignment without discussion, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. You didn't explain why you gave your best section to your best person. You just did it and moved on. He spent 20 minutes before service walking the floor. This was something he'd always done, not because it was required, but because a room was a system, and systems rewarded people who understood them before they were under pressure. He noted the sightlines from each table to the kitchen doors. He identified the 2 centerpieces whose bases were sitting slightly uneven on the tablecloths, the kind of minor instability that became a problem when someone gestured too broadly mid-conversation. He repositioned them both with 2 fingers, small adjustments, barely visible. He checked the water station nearest his section and found one of the pitchers had a hairline chip along the pour lip. He swapped it without ceremony. The ballroom itself was a particular kind of beautiful that had nothing to do with warmth. It was the beauty of expense, of surfaces that reflected light because they'd been selected to, of flowers that had traveled farther than most of the guests' morning commutes, of a ceiling fixture that probably cost more than Marcus's annual rent and illuminated nothing you couldn't have. Illuminated more cheaply. He didn't resent it. He'd worked in rooms like this long enough that the opulence had become neutral information like weather. What he noticed instead was the layout, the acoustics, the fact that sound carried differently near the east wall than the west, which meant conversations at the center tables would be audible, really audible, to the surrounding floor if voices rose above a certain register. He filed that away for no particular reason. At 6:50, the guests began arriving, and the room transformed the way expensive rooms did. It absorbed the people designed for it, and made them look inevitable. Women in gowns that cost what Marcus made in a month. Men in suits cut close enough to suggest they'd been measured recently. The soft percussion of heels on marble, the ambient music from the quartet in the corner, the precise choreography of 300 people performing the version of themselves they'd decided tonight deserved. Marcus moved through it all the way water moves through stone, present, purposeful, leaving no mark. It was near the end of the first course that he saw her. She was standing at the edge of the room near the service corridor entrance, which was an unusual place for someone in a gown that expensive to be standing. Dark hair, early 40s, the particular posture of someone whose job required her to be ready for anything at any given moment. She was looking at her phone, then at the room, then back at her phone, with the focused distraction of someone managing 16 things and pretending to manage only one. She glanced up as Marcus passed with a tray, and their eyes met for half a second. Something moved across her face. Not recognition, exactly. More like the edge of it. A word on the tip of a tongue. She looked away first. Marcus continued toward table 7. If you want to know what she was almost remembering and why it would change everything by the end of this night, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is only getting started, and you will not want to miss what comes next. He refilled the water glasses and moved on. Desmond Varro arrived at 8:14, which was intentional. Not late enough to be rude, late enough to be noticed. There was a calibration to it, the kind of entrance that only worked if the room was already full, already settled, already committed to its own conversations, so that the interruption of his arrival could ripple outward from the door like a stone dropped in still water. He'd been doing it for years. He knew exactly what it cost him in logistics and exactly what it returned in presence. The room responded the way rooms always did. Heads turned. Conversation softened at the edges. The quartet adjusted almost imperceptibly, not stopping, just accommodating, the way music does when something louder enters. He was taller than most people expected from his photographs. 6'2", broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal suit that had been made for him in a city he visited twice a year specifically for that purpose. His hair was the distinguished kind of silver that arrived early in wealthy families and was received as an asset. He moved through the room with the particular ease of a man who had decided long ago that spaces existed to receive him, and had never been seriously contradicted. Marcus watched him from the water station near the east wall. Not with judgment. With the same attention he gave everything in his section, neutral, observational, the quiet data gathering of someone who understood that the most useful information was usually collected before anything happened. Desmond Varro was, from a service perspective, a specific type of guest, the kind whose needs were partly logistical and partly performative, which meant you had to anticipate what he actually required and separately anticipate what he needed to be seen receiving. They were not always the same thing. He worked the room in a wide arc before finding his table. Marcus tracked the arc without appearing to. Desmond moved from cluster to cluster with the efficiency of someone for whom small talk was a professional discipline rather than a social instinct. A hand on a shoulder here. A laugh deployed precisely there, not too long, never self-deprecating enough to suggest vulnerability. He collected people the way a room collected light, drawing them toward him and then releasing them slightly diminished as though proximity to him had transferred something in his direction. His table was the center table. Of course it was. 8 guests, all of them the kind of people whose names appeared in the financial press without irony, board members, a senator's chief economic advisor, 2 investors whose combined portfolio could have funded a small nation's infrastructure program, and a woman Marcus would later learn was a journalist from a publication that covered technology and power with the particular appetite of someone who enjoyed watching both be tested. Desmond sat. The table reorganized itself around him without being asked. His head of security, a quiet man named Rourke who wore his earpiece like punctuation, stationed himself near the east wall, close enough to respond, far enough to be deniable. Marcus had already noted where Rourke stood. They'd exchanged nods the way professionals in adjacent fields sometimes did, a brief acknowledgement of shared competence with no further elaboration required. The first course arrived at Desmond's table at 8:22. Marcus served it. Desmond didn't look at him. This was standard. Some guests treated servers as furniture, some treated them as staff, and a small number treated them as people, and the distribution across those categories mapped quite reliably onto other things Marcus had noticed about those same guests over the years. He adjusted his assessment of Desmond Varro accordingly, and moved on. By the third course, the table was fully alive with the specific energy of powerful people competing to be the most relaxed version of themselves. Desmond led this the way he led everything, by setting the temperature and letting others find their place within it. He was, Marcus noted with professional detachment, genuinely good at this. The charm was real enough, even if the warmth behind it wasn't. The senator's advisor said something about regulatory frameworks. One of the investors offered a counterpoint. The journalist listened with the quality of attention that meant she was recording everything without recording anything. Desmond leaned back in his chair and smiled the smile of a man who had already decided how every conversation in this room would end. He had no idea, in that moment, that two things were already in motion that would dismantle that certainty entirely. One of them was a hairline fracture spreading silently through the architecture of his digital empire, 200 miles away in a server room that hummed with the sound of his entire fortune breathing. The other was Marcus, moving quietly toward his table with a water pitcher, watching the centerpiece on the far end begin its slow, almost imperceptible tilt. The centerpiece was a tall arrangement, white orchids in a glass vessel, elegant and entirely impractical, the kind of thing chosen for photographs rather than tables where people actually moved their arms. Marcus had flagged it during his pre-service walk, noted the uneven base, made an adjustment. But the tablecloth had shifted slightly during the third-course service, and now the vessel was doing what poorly balanced things on uneven surfaces eventually did. He saw it from 4 steps away. The woman beside it was 70, maybe 72, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a brooch on her left shoulder that Marcus recognized as the kind of thing inherited rather than purchased. She was mid-conversation, animated, her right hand gesturing in the direction of the vessel without knowing it. One more gesture like that and the orchids were going over, directly into her lap, glass and water and all. Marcus covered the remaining steps in a single smooth movement, set the pitcher down with his left hand and caught the base of the vessel with his right, stabilizing it without sound, without interruption, without drawing a single eye from the conversation happening around him. He held it for 3 seconds while quietly repositioning it on the tablecloth, then retrieved the pitcher and resumed his approach to refill the glasses on the far side. The elderly woman never broke her sentence. That was the half-second pause that Desmond Varro noticed. Not the catch, not the woman, not the vessel that would have shattered across her lap. Just the pause, the fractional delay between Marcus arriving at the table's edge and beginning to pour. One beat off the rhythm Desmond had apparently decided was acceptable, and that, for reasons that lived somewhere in the architecture of who Desmond Varro was and what he needed a Saturday evening to confirm about the world, was enough. "Slow night for you?" Desmond said. His voice carried. The acoustics near the center tables were exactly what Marcus had noted during his walk. Sound moved outward here, clean and unobstructed, reaching the surrounding floor without effort. Several heads at the adjacent table turned before Desmond had finished the sentence. Marcus continued pouring. "I'll have you taken care of shortly, sir. I'm sure you will." Desmond picked up his wine glass, examined it with the theatrical attention of someone who wanted to be seen examining it. "I'm just saying, I've seen faster movement from men twice your age. Must be a long week." The table offered the expected light laughter, the social contract of power. When the most important person at the table performs amusement, others locate their amusement quickly. Marcus set the pitcher down. He looked at Desmond with an expression that gave nothing away, not deference, not defiance, simply the level gaze of a man who had been looked at dismissively by people with considerably more authority than this, and had learned that such moments passed. "Can I get you anything else?" he said. That calm, apparently, was the wrong answer. Something sharpened in Desmond's expression, the micro-irritation of a man who expected friction and received none, and found the absence of friction more offensive than friction would have been. He set his glass down and leaned back in his chair, and when he spoke again the performance quality of it had increased, pitched now not just for the table, but for the surrounding floor. "You know what I find fascinating?" he said, addressing the table but watching Marcus. "The way some men just settle. You can see it in how they carry themselves. No ambition, no edge. He gestured vaguely at Marcus's uniform, plates and pitchers until the lights go out." He shook his head with the practiced sorrow of a man who found other people's limitations personally disappointing. "I built 3 companies by the time I was your age. What do you suppose the difference is?" The table had gone the specific quiet of people who were uncomfortable and had decided that discomfort was someone else's problem. The journalist was watching with her glass halfway to her mouth. Marcus stood at the edge of the table for a moment that lasted slightly longer than it should have. He looked at Desmond Varro. Really looked at him, the way you look at something you are deciding whether to engage with or simply move past, and then he set the water pitcher down on the service tray, straightened his jacket, and said, quietly and without any particular emotion, "I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, sir." He turned and walked back toward the service station. Behind him, Desmond said something to the table that drew louder laughter than the first. Marcus didn't hear the exact words. He didn't need to. He was already thinking about Lily, about whether she'd managed to sleep, about the small notebook in his jacket pocket with Dr. Fenwick's adjusted dosage written in his careful handwriting. He was not thinking about Desmond Varro. Not yet. The service corridor behind the ballroom was 12 feet wide and lit with the particular fluorescence of spaces not meant to be seen. Functional, unsparing. The kind of light that showed everything. Stainless steel carts lined the left wall. The right wall had a row of hooks where aprons hung between courses. The floor was the linoleum Marcus had noted on his first shift here 6 months ago, worn in a path down the center from decades of people moving quickly between the kitchen and the door. He stood at the far end, near the staff phone station, and called Clara, the retired schoolteacher 2 floors below him who watched Lily on his evening shifts. Clara answered on the second ring the way she always did, promptly, without alarm, which was itself a form of kindness. Lily was asleep, had gone down without trouble, which meant the adjusted dosage was already doing something useful. Clara had read her 2 chapters of the book they were working through, and Lily had requested a 3rd chapter, and then been asleep before the 3rd chapter was 4 pages in, which Clara reported with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had won a minor and pleasant negotiation. Marcus thanked her. He meant it the way he meant most things, completely and without elaboration. He hung up and stood for a moment in the fluorescent quiet. The dining room noise was muffled here, reduced to a low murmur that moved through the walls like something underwater. He could hear the kitchen. The specific controlled chaos of 7 courses being choreographed under pressure, the clatter and call of it, the heat of it coming through the door in warm pulses whenever someone pushed through. He breathed it in and let the moment be what it was. He wasn't angry. This was something people sometimes found difficult to believe about him, and he understood why. A man is publicly reduced in a room full of witnesses, and the expected response is heat, resentment, wounded pride, the particular burn of humiliation that sits in the chest and demands acknowledgement. Marcus felt none of it, or rather felt it briefly and then placed it somewhere quiet, the way you place a glass on a shelf, present, contained, no longer in your hand. He'd been spoken to worse, by people with considerably more legitimate authority, in rooms where the stakes had been considerably higher, in situations where the right to be angry was both warranted and completely irrelevant. He'd learned a long time ago that anger was expensive, and he ran a careful budget. He checked his watch. 12 minutes before the 4th course, he straightened his jacket, picked up his tray, and turned back toward the ballroom door. That was when he almost walked directly into Priya Solis. She was standing just inside the corridor entrance with her phone in one hand and an expression that Marcus had seen before on people who were trying to reconcile two pieces of information that didn't quite fit together yet. She was looking at him with the particular focus of someone who had stopped moving specifically because he was there. "I'm sorry," she said, and then didn't move. Marcus waited. "This is going to sound strange," she said. "All right." She glanced at her phone screen, then back at him. "Did you work for Nova Tire Federal Systems?" The question landed in the corridor the way certain questions do, with a weight that suggested the person asking already suspected the answer and was giving you the opportunity to confirm it before they acted on it. Marcus looked at her for a moment. She was mid-40s, precise in the way of someone whose job required precision, and she was holding her phone with the screen toward her chest now, which meant she'd found something she wasn't sure she should have found. "That was a few years ago," he said. Something shifted in her face. Not surprised, she'd been moving toward this conclusion for a while, he could see that. More like the specific feeling of a lock turning over. "I thought I recognized you," she said, quietly, almost to herself. "Your posture, the way she stopped, started again. I attended a federal infrastructure briefing in 2021. You presented the Nova Tire security architecture to a joint oversight panel." She paused. "You had different hair." Marcus said nothing. Priya looked at her phone again. Whatever she'd found there, a profile, a photograph, a name attached to a title that didn't match the apron in front of her, she looked at it for 3 seconds, and then looked back at him with an expression that had moved past surprise and into something more serious. "I need to make a call," she said, more to herself than to him. She was already turning away when Marcus spoke. "Fourth course starts in 10 minutes, he said evenly. "I need to get back to the floor." She nodded without turning around, her phone already at her ear. If you want to know who she was calling and why that call would bring the entire room to a standstill within the hour, hit subscribe and stay with us, because the next part of this story is where everything begins to turn. Marcus pushed through the ballroom door and walked back into the light. Priya Solis did not go back to her table immediately. She stood in the narrow alcove between the service corridor and the east hallway, a transitional space, neither ballroom nor backstage, the kind of architectural in-between that hotels built without intending to give anyone a place to fall apart quietly. She had her back to the wall and her phone pressed to her ear, and she was waiting for Agent Theo Burke to pick up with the specific patience of someone who knew the call was too important to leave a voicemail for. He answered on the 4th ring, "Priya." His voice had the quality of someone working late who had expected the phone to ring eventually. "It's been a while." It has. She kept her voice low, angled away from the ballroom noise leaking under the door. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." A pause. "All right. Marcus Hale, former director of cyber infrastructure at Nova Tire Federal." She looked at the photograph she'd pulled up on her phone, a federal briefing document, partially redacted, his face clear in the panel photograph. Is he still considered a valid resource? If something came up in his area? The silence on the other end was brief, but specific. The silence of someone recalibrating what kind of conversation they were in. "Why are you asking me that tonight?" Burke said. "Because he's here," Priya said. "He's working the gala I'm attending." As a server. Another silence. Longer this time. "Priya." Burke's voice had changed register, quieter, more careful. "Is this a social call, or do you have a reason to be concerned about something?" She thought about that, about the way she'd watched him move through the dining room earlier, that precise, unhurried economy of motion that didn't belong to someone who'd spent their career carrying trays. About the way he'd caught the centerpiece without breaking stride, without drawing attention, with the automatic competence of someone trained to manage instability before it became a problem. about the look on his face when Desmond had performed his contempt for the table, not wounded, not diminished, just patient in a way that suggested he was waiting for something to pass rather than reacting to something that had landed. "I don't have a reason," she said carefully. I wanted to know if the answer was yes." "The answer," Burke said slowly, "is that Marcus Hale is on a short list of people this division would contact if certain categories of infrastructure problem became active. His clearance lapsed when he left Nova Tire, but his knowledge didn't." A pause. "He designed the system, Priya. You can't revoke that." She closed her eyes briefly. "Thank you," she said. "That's all I needed." She hung up and stood in the alcove with the ambient noise of the gala pressing softly through the walls around her. The quartet, the conversation, the precise rhythm of a room full of powerful people enjoying an evening that was, as far as any of them knew, going exactly as planned. Her champagne was still on the table inside, untouched and certainly warm by now. She didn't go back for it. Instead, she opened her email and pulled up the thread she'd been half monitoring since before dinner, the running operations update from Varotech's infrastructure team that she received automatically as chief of staff and almost never needed to read at a gala. She scrolled past the 7:15 update, which had been routine, and found the 8:43 entry, which was not. The language was technical and carefully restrained in the way that internal communications were when the people writing them were trying not to cause panic while clearly being panicked. Words like anomalous cascade and containment protocol initiated and status, monitoring that, to someone who had spent 4 years sitting adjacent to the technology division and absorbing its vocabulary by proximity, translated fairly cleanly into, "Something is wrong, and we do not yet know how wrong." She read it twice. Then she looked at the ballroom door. Desmond was in there, performing the version of himself that this room had paid to see. Confident, magnetic, untouchable. His technology team was 200 miles away watching something they didn't fully understand yet deteriorate in a direction they couldn't control, and in the service corridor on the other side of the same wall, a man in a white apron possessed the precise knowledge required to understand both the problem and its solution, because he had built the architecture that was currently being turned against itself. The irony of it was so complete, it almost had a shape. Priya put her phone in her clutch and straightened the way she did when she'd made a decision and was moving toward it. She wasn't doing this for Desmond. She'd worked for him long enough to hold no particular illusions about what he deserved from an evening like this one. She was doing it because the operations report had mentioned 3 financial institutions whose client data was currently sitting inside that compromised system, and because at the scale they were talking about, this stopped being a corporate problem and became something else entirely. She pushed open the ballroom door. The room received her the way it always did, without noticing. She scanned the floor until she found Marcus near the service station at the far west wall, refilling a tray with the same quiet attention he'd brought to every task she'd watched him perform tonight. She began moving toward him, threading between tables, her expression arranged into something that would not cause alarm to anyone watching. She was halfway across the floor when her phone vibrated in her clutch. She already knew who it was before she looked. Burke. Calling back. She answered it mid-stride and listened for 11 seconds, and then stopped walking entirely in the middle of the ballroom floor, because what he'd said in those 11 seconds had changed the specific weight of everything that was about to happen. "It's active," Burke said. As of 9 minutes ago, it crossed the federal notification threshold. Priya stood perfectly still in the middle of the ballroom floor, with 300 people moving around her like water around a stone. A waiter passed on her left with a dessert tray. Someone laughed at the table nearest her. A bright social laugh that belonged to a completely different evening than the one she was now standing inside. "How bad?" she said quietly. Bad enough that I'm calling you back. A pause, and she could hear keyboard movement in the background, the particular rapid rhythm of people working a problem under pressure. 3 enterprise clients are financial institutions. Live transaction architecture. The attack vector is using the system's own logic against itself. Our analysts are saying whoever is in there knows the original design intimately, not just the documentation, the actual decision-making behind the build. She started walking again. Slower now, more deliberate. Your team can't contain it? We've had 4 people on it since the alert triggered. They're working from the recovery protocol documentation. Another pause. The protocol isn't holding. Whatever this is, it was built to defeat the documented response. Which means the person who designed the system is the only one who knows what the documentation doesn't say, Priya finished. Silence on the line. Where is he? Burke said. She was already looking at him. Marcus was at the West Service Station, his back to the room, resetting a tray with the methodical attention he brought to everything. 20 feet away. In a white apron, completely unaware that the problem he'd spent the most significant years of his professional life building a solution for had just become active on a Saturday evening while he was refilling water glasses at a charity gala. Close, she said. I'll call you back in 2 minutes. She hung up and covered the remaining distance to the service station with the kind of pace that was just below the threshold of visibly urgent, fast enough to mean business, controlled enough not to alarm the room. Marcus. He turned. His expression when he looked at her was the same it had been in the corridor, open, unhurried, giving nothing away. I need a moment, she said. Please. Something in the quality of her voice must have communicated what the words didn't, because he set the tray down without question and turned to face her fully. She was aware of the room around them, the ambient noise, the movement, the fact that Desmond's table was 40 feet away, and Desmond was currently holding court on some point of business that had the table nodding in the performative agreement of people who found agreement professionally useful. She kept her voice low. There's a situation developing with Varotech's primary data infrastructure, she said. I've been on the phone with the FBI's cyber division. They have analysts working it right now, and the containment protocol isn't holding. She watched his face as she said the next part. The attack is using the system's own architecture against itself. Burke's team believes it requires someone with original design knowledge to address it in real time. Marcus looked at her for a moment without speaking. His expression didn't change in the way she'd half expected, no sudden alertness, no visible shift into a different mode. If anything, he went more still, which she was beginning to understand was what it looked like when he was processing something quickly and completely. Which system? He said. The Novatire core. The cloud infrastructure licensing. I know which licensing, he said quietly. Which layer is compromised? The question was so precise and so immediate that it stopped her for a half second. I don't, Burke would know. He's waiting for me to call back. Marcus looked past her toward the ballroom, not at anything specific, the look of someone running a rapid internal calculation. Then he looked back at her. Call him, he said. Put it on speaker. She already had the phone out. Burke answered before the second ring, and Priya held the phone between them, low, angled away from the nearest table. Burke, she said, I have Marcus Hale. A beat of silence on the line that carried its own specific weight. Mr. Hale. Burke's voice shifted, not deferential exactly, but recalibrated, the way professionals recalibrate when they're speaking to someone who outranks their problem. We have a cascade failure originating in the authentication layer that's migrating toward the transaction processing core. The vector is recursive trust exploitation, Marcus said. Someone fed the verification system a credential chain it recognizes as internal. It's been authenticating the attack because it thinks it's authenticating itself. Complete silence on the line. Then Burke said, carefully, that is exactly what our analysts just concluded after 40 minutes of work. There's a manual override, Marcus said. It's not in the documentation. Mr. Hale. It was a contingency I built into the original architecture for exactly this scenario. It requires a 12-character sequence entered directly into the primary console, physical access, or Level 1 remote, which means someone on your team needs clearance to. We have Level 1 remote, Burke said, and Marcus could hear the controlled urgency underneath the professional composure. We have it right now. What's the sequence? Marcus was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Priya watched his face during those 3 seconds, watched him make a decision that had nothing to do with Desmond Varro or the evening's humiliation, or any of the things that would have been entirely reasonable to factor into the calculation. He was somewhere else entirely. In the architecture of the thing, running his hands along walls he'd built years ago in the dark, finding the door he'd left there for exactly this kind of night. Get your analyst to the primary console, he said, and get me something to write on. Priya reached into her clutch and produced a card and a pen without hesitation. Marcus took them, turned the card over to its blank side, and began writing. The Matrides podium stood at the threshold between the ballroom and the reception foyer, a mahogany lectern with a brass lamp and a surface just wide enough to hold an open reservation book and, as it turned out, a laptop belonging to Varro Tech's CTO who had materialized via video call on Priya's device with the specific pallor of a man who had aged 4 years in the last 40 minutes. His name was Gordon Fitch, and he was 53 years old and had run technology operations for Desmond Varro for 6 years, and in all of that time he had never made a call to his employer during a Saturday gala because Gordon Fitch was the kind of man who solved problems before they required that kind of call. Tonight he had failed to be that kind of man, and it showed in every pixel of his face on the screen. Priya had positioned the laptop on the podium at